Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our final lesson in Chapter 12. Chapter 12, Section 3, A New Crisis. So today we're going to talk about the end of Andrew Jackson's presidency and the legacy that he left behind for presidents following after him. So specifically, we're going to focus in on how did the issue of states' rights and the Indian Removal Act affect Jackson's legacy. So these two things are going to have long-lasting impacts on the presidency and B, the American government in general. And like always, there's an audio recording that you could use. Otherwise, let's continue on with our key terms for today. And our key terms for today are states' rights, Nullification Act, the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, and mudslinging. Some of these actually should be familiar. We've talked about states' rights and nullification in the past, and you also, in the introduction to this chapter, we looked at the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, so some of these may sound familiar. Hopefully they do. But as we start, I want us to examine this picture of two friends fighting over who knows what, and I want us to ask ourselves, what can cause friends or allies to turn on each other? Or maybe a better way of asking that is, which is more important, your friends or your beliefs? It is important to be loyal to your friends, but it's also important to stick to your beliefs. Now, I have a little bit of experience with this in my own life. I once had a very close friend, but something happened that caused us to stop talking. Now, I miss hanging out with this guy. I miss his friendship, but it's one issue where my beliefs had to come first. And I say that because in today's lesson, we're going to see that President Andrew Jackson and his vice president, John C. Calhoun, had been friends for many years and political allies, but their opposing beliefs on the issues of states' rights or the right to limit the power of the federal government, that's going to end up dividing these men, and in this case, their beliefs were too strong for either man to put friendship first. But before that, a little bit of backstory. All right, in 1828, Congress passed a tariff which was the highest at that point in U.S. history. The tariff was meant to protect American businesses from European competition, but what it ended up doing was hurting a lot of the businesses, especially in the South. Southern planters depended on European markets for their goods, and many also bought European goods, so they depended on the European markets to sell their tobacco and cotton, but they also depended on it for buying their own goods from Europe. So the high tariff increased the prices of many of these goods, and many felt that the tariff was just completely unconstitutional. One of whom was John C. Calhoun. Now, Calhoun had fought hard against the tariff by claiming that the states had the right to nullify a federal law if it deemed it unconstitutional. And remember, to nullify means to just cancel out. So what Calhoun was saying, that if states did not agree with a federal law, then they had the right to cancel that law within their borders. The states had created the federal government, so they had the right to limit its powers. Now, opposing Calhoun was the president, Andrew Jackson, and Daniel Webster, who we've talked about before. Webster especially argued that the Constitution united the people, not just the states. And if states could nullify laws, then the nation would fall apart. And it was anger over this tariff, or as the Southerners called it, the tariff of abomination. This anger increased and increased in the South. Calhoun got so upset that he resigned from being vice president and became a senator for South Carolina. Now, eventually, Congress passed a much lower tariff, but that still did not satisfy South Carolina, which passed a nullification act that declared even this new tariff illegal. And they threatened to secede if the federal government tried to interfere. And secede means to break away from, or in this case, to leave the United States. And it was this threat of secession that really upset President Jackson, because he knew that if all states could pass acts like the Nullification Act, then it could lead to a civil war. And he took a very strong stand in support of a compromise tariff, and the show of strength convinced other states not to join South Carolina. And eventually, South Carolina repealed the Nullification Act, and civil war was avoided for now. But this issue of states' rights versus federal rights did not go away completely. And as we're going to see in just a few short years, it's going to come right back up, but it's going to take a slightly different look. So Congress passes the tariff. The Southerners get angry over it, call it the Tariff of Abominations. South Carolina especially threatens to secede. They passed the Nullification Act under the leadership of John C. Calhoun, threatened to secede. Jackson's upset, so he says that states cannot do this. He passes a compromise tariff, and eventually South Carolina backs down. But as you can see, this issue of states' rights versus federal rights is pretty big, and it's a pretty divisive issue. And our next video is going to talk about the nullification crisis.
To the South's great statesman, Vice President John C. Calhoun, the word union did not mean majority rule, but the coexistence of many separate interests. To protect South Carolina's main interest, agriculture, state delegates met in Charleston in 1832 and passed an ordinance declaring the Tariff of Abominations null and void. Jackson could not tolerate such disobedience to federal authority. He countered with a proclamation to the people of South Carolina saying,
"Our social compact in express terms declares that the laws of the United States, its Constitution, and treaties made under it are the supreme law of the land."
2 weeks before South Carolina's nullification ordinance was to take effect, Jackson asked that the Army and Navy be used to uphold the revenue laws in what was known as the Force Bill. South Carolina responded by raising a militia. Secession and Civil War were forestalled only when Henry Clay introduced a compromise tariff bill into the Senate. Both sides could then claim victory, and the states' rights question would have to wait another 30 years to be resolved.
Within the South he nullified the voice of civil war and forced due honor to our flag from nations near and far.
Even as president, Jackson's military training caused him to see events in his political life as battles. During his first term, he closed ranks within the government as he fought to preserve the Union. He cleared his administration of Vice President Calhoun and his supporters. And as he faced re-election in 1832 with his new running mate, Martin Van Buren, he gathered ammunition for what was to become his full-scale war against the Second Bank of the United States.
So it's been very clear that Jackson believes in a strong federal government. Remember, we talked about he believed in a very strong presidency and a strong federal government, and he made no attempts to hide that. And he especially made this clear with the way that he dealt with Native Americans. Now, ever since the colonial period, white settlers had been forcing natives off their land and forcing them westward and southern until they got to an area where they wanted that land. Then they pushed them off a little bit more. And despite resistance, the settlers just kept coming. So in the American Southeast, the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians, among others, had lived in the area that is now the southeastern United States for generations, and they hoped to live at peace with the white settlers. Now, keep this in mind. They had accepted that the white settlers were going to be coming into their area, and they hoped to live in peace with those settlers. They knew and they accepted that as this country grew, more Americans were going to settle in these lands. The land was great for farming, was very fertile, and perfect especially for growing cotton. So more and more settlers moved in, taking more and more land from these tribes. Now, Jackson had Congress set aside lands in the Louisiana Territory, especially for Native Americans, and was able to either persuade or force many of the tribes to move there, all of which was west of the Mississippi River. And Jackson did so to give white settlers access to these fertile fields, as well as to protect the Native American tribes from destruction. And if we remember all the way back to Chapter 5, the British government had made a similar declaration in the Proclamation of 1763, which had forbidden colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains to reserve that land for Native American tribes. Now, if the government told you to leave your home because somebody else wanted it, how would you react? Would you turn around and say, oh, sure, take whatever you want. I'll just go and move hundreds of miles away to lands that nobody else wants? Or would you resist? Now imagine that if it's not your own government telling you to do this, but say the government of Canada or of some other neighboring nation. What would you do? Not surprisingly, many resisted this request from the U.S. government. Some of the tribes had adapted their way of life to fit in better with the growing American society. The Cherokee Nation created a system of government that blended their own traditions with European traditions and even formed their own alphabet. Others believed that they would be spared if they sided with the Americans in the War of 1812. And the gentleman actually that we're looking at right here is Sequoyah, who was a Cherokee silversmith and is the one credited with creating the Cherokee alphabet based on the syllables of the Cherokee language. And here is Sequoyah's Cherokee alphabet. But unfortunately, that didn't stop Georgia from making its own laws for the Cherokee Nation in 1828. So the Cherokee Nation took the state of Georgia to court for violating previous treaties that they had with the United States federal government. So let's get this straight. The state of Georgia created its own laws for dealing with the Cherokee Nation that violated previous treaties that had been made between the federal government and the Cherokee Nation. So the Cherokee Nation takes the state of Georgia to court for violating those treaties. And in 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokees and declared Georgia's actions unconstitutional. So Supreme Court rules in favor of the Cherokee Nation, but President Jackson refused to back this decision. And that almost seems hypocritical of him, because during the nullification crisis, he had defended the rights and the power of the federal government over states' rights, but this time he defended the rights of Georgia over the Supreme Court's decision. So in 1830, Jackson and his supporters pushed the Indian Removal Act through Congress, and this act forced Native Americans living east of the Mississippi River to move to lands west of the Mississippi in the area that was the Louisiana Purchase. And some went peacefully, but many tried to stay in the lands that they had grown up in. So by 1838, the United States Army forced 15,000 Cherokee Indians to march hundreds of miles westward, and that journey we've talked about before is now known as the Trail of Tears because of the sorrow that it caused the Cherokee Nation by claiming thousands of lives of women and children. And in Florida, the Seminole Indians continued to resist the U.S. government even past that. And after 3 wars known as the Seminole Wars, which went from 1817, we talked about the first one with General Andrew Jackson at that time. So they went from 1817 through 1858. By 1858, the Seminoles were defeated and forced to leave Florida. And further north, the Sauk and Fox Indians put up resistance, but also were defeated by federal troops. And with the defeat of these northern tribes, Native American resistance in the east was pretty much over. So what does that tell us about President Jackson? Well, his legacy to today is that he was a president who really liked getting his own way. He fought very fiercely for issues that he believed in, but turned his back on Native Americans because of this deep-seated hatred he had for them. He promoted a strong federal government and a strong presidency, but would argue for states' rights if they matched up with his personal beliefs. So, if there's anything that I can say about President Andrew Jackson is that he was a very complex man who fought fiercely for his beliefs, but if you got in his way, you would feel the wrath of that fierce fighting.
In handling disputes over Indian lands, Jackson brushed aside treaties that had been made with America's Indians to open up new territory for Western expansion. In perhaps his most serious abuse of executive authority, Jackson bowed to the expansionist desires by calling for the removal of Indian nations to the unsettled regions west of the Mississippi. This, he claimed, would strengthen the federal union while protecting the Indians from harassment from white settlers. Prosperous and peaceful Indians were deluded into surrendering to eloquent but empty promises of the white man. They signed new treaties offering what appeared to be the promise of a safe, permanent home and payment for travel expenses. The reality was a trail of tears. Crops and homes were taken, and Indians were then driven like cattle through barren, wintry territory. Underfed, underclothed, and feet bleeding from the long marches, their numbers were drastically reduced by disease on the journey. President Jackson's ruthless actions set an enduring precedent for America's already shameful Indian policy.
So after Jackson leaves office, this man, Martin Van Buren, was elected into office. Now, he had served as Jackson's Secretary of State and wasn't as popular as Jackson, but he was very clever and very intelligent. Unfortunately, only 2 months after being elected, Van Buren faced the worst economic disaster in the country's history up to that point. Hi, you remember me? Yes, the Bank of the United States. We're going to keep on talking about it. Remember back in the last section how we talked about everything with Jackson was a personal vendetta and he waged a war on the Bank of the United States? Well, when he refused to re-sign the charter for the bank, it was forced to close in 1836. Now, with this federal bank closed, state and local banks were able to loan as much money as they wanted. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough money in circulation for the loans that they were giving. So states began printing more and more money that wasn't backed by gold or silver. They basically just said, we don't have enough money, we'll just print some more. That's fine. And just before leaving office, Jackson ordered anyone buying public land to pay for it with gold or silver, not the newly printed paper money. Now, most banks didn't have enough gold and silver to meet those demands, so they were forced to close. So you have a lot of paper money in circulation and people trying to buy land with gold and silver, but the banks don't have enough to meet those demands, so a lot of the banks closed, and unfortunately the federal bank was also closed. What to do? So that brings us to Martin Van Buren's time. Now, 2 months into his presidency, these closing banks sparked an economic depression which ended up lasting 3 years. And it started in 1837, so it's known now as the Panic of 1837. By printing more money than was able to be backed by gold or silver, the value of the money dropped drastically. And at one point, 90% of the U.S. factories closed, leaving thousands of people unemployed. Now remember, Van Buren's election did not cause the Panic of 1837, but since it happened so soon, so close to the start of his presidency, he took the blame for it. As president, Van Buren was blamed by the public for the Depression, and he held very strongly to laissez-faire economic policies, which didn't help to combat the Depression, so the Depression continued for the next 3 years, and as the Depression continued, his popularity sank. And as we see in this cartoon, you see men here to collect the rent, but the father has no money and has been out of work for so long that he can't pay the rent. And we can't feed the children, and the children are so hungry.
There was talk of a third term for Jackson in 1836, but since he was in poor health, he did the next best thing. He chose his own successor.
There's a queer little man, and they call him Martin Van. He was reckoned quite a magical affair. He was mounted on the back of the sturdy Andy Jack when he popped into the presidential chair.
Van Buren became the 8th president of the United States, since the Whigs were still too disorganized to mount a solid opposition. Van Buren may have been even more of a true Democrat than Jackson. He abolished imprisonment for debt and granted labor's plea for a 10-hour day. However, the financial crisis of the country deepened during Van Buren's administration, and he and Jackson were blamed for it. Killing the bank, the Whig press claimed, had produced a ghost in the form of an economic crisis. The shift to specie currency put a tremendous drain on the nation's resources. Since there wasn't enough gold and silver to meet demands, the West had to borrow from the East, and the East had to borrow from Europe. Attempts to cure Uncle Sam seemed worse than the disease, as the nation plunged into a severe depression. In the Panic of 1837, people tried to withdraw their funds from the banks. Shipping came to a standstill. Manufacturing was down, and the price of flour went up so high that bread became a luxury workers couldn't afford. The only people who were doing well, it seemed, were the liquor stores and the loan sharks. The total picture was one of economic chaos, which it was claimed Jackson created out of his love of personal glory. Jackson had called his use of the deposit banks an experiment, as was the hard money idea, but he had never fully thought through what form he wanted America's banking system to take. Were economic conditions of the Jacksonian era, as his critics claimed, a result of his policies, or were they simply part of the normal cycle of the capitalist system? At Whig headquarters, there was no doubt about where to lay the blame. Taking the opportunity to make a political issue out of the situation, the Whigs achieved a landslide victory in 1840. Yet the irony of the 1840 campaign was that the conservative Whigs co-opted the methods of the Jacksonian Democrats. Their candidate, an unknown named William Henry Harrison, was billed as the military hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe.
The change of the administration will be for the good of the nation, for it's now in a bad situation, so we'll put in old Tippecanoe.
He even adopted the Jackson pose. Although he was actually a wealthy man, tied to upper-class interests, Harrison was advised not to open his mouth on any issue. The voters could imagine him as a folksy man of the West in a log cabin and hard cider campaign.
The best thing that we can do is to put in old Tippecanoe.
The opposition, Van Buren, was painted by the Whigs as being corrupt and aristocratic, an enemy of labor. The voters were besieged with buttons, banners, popular songs, and paraphernalia. The manipulation of public opinion was more and more becoming part of the American political game.
Which brings us to the election of 1840. Now, despite being unpopular, Van Buren was chosen again as the Democratic candidate for the 1840 election. And running against him was William Henry Harrison of Ohio, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, with John Tyler as his running mate. So the Whigs focused on Harrison's war record in their campaign, and they came up with the very witty slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, which it's got a nice ring to it. And this campaign was similar to the campaign that Jackson had a decade earlier, in that the party focused on his war history and portrayed him as being a man of the people who had been born in a log cabin. Now, that may have been true, but at the time, Harrison was actually very wealthy and lived in a mansion. Even though he was born in a log cabin, he had made some money in his day. So both parties had their candidates travel around the country to meet with people and shake hands, and both engaged in mudslinging. And we've talked about mudslinging in the past, using insults, lies, half-truths, anything that you can to attack your opponent's reputation versus attacking the issues. And like I said, we've talked about it before, and I know that we're going to talk about it again, because it's a legal tradition that gets repeated every time there's a presidential election. And not even a presidential election. Anytime there's an election for anything, there's a very good chance that somebody's going to, at some point, attack the other person's character rather than focusing only on the issues. I mean, why talk about the issues when you can talk about somebody's personal problems instead? It's way more fun. So Tippecanoe and Tyler too was able to push them through, and Harrison won the election, but unfortunately died of pneumonia soon after taking the oath of office. So he was succeeded by his running mate, John Tyler. Now, the Whigs had planned on creating a new Bank of the United States to help improve roads and canals, to demand high tariffs, and if Harrison had been the president, he would have completely supported these programs and would have been able to push them through Congress. Tyler, however, was the president they ended up with, and he didn't share those same opinions with the other members of his political party. He had formerly been a Democrat and opposed many Whig plans to build the economy. So any bills that were pushed through to try and recharter the Bank of the United States, he vetoed them. And following this, most of Tyler's cabinet resigned, and the Whigs threw him out of their party. So imagine that. The President of the United States was kicked out of his own party.
8 of our presidents have died while in office, either from natural causes or by assassination. We're going to focus on 5 of their vice presidents who were suddenly raised to power in the wake of national tragedy. They were known in their time as the accidental presidents, each thrown into a situation of extreme difficulty. It's an unpredictable tradition that began with the country's 10th chief executive, John Tyler.
By a deplored event, I was unexpectedly elevated to the presidency. For the first time in our history, the person elected to the vice presidency of the United States has had devolved upon him the presidential office.
In many ways, John Tyler seemed like a natural for the high office. Raised on a 12,000-acre Virginia plantation, he'd attended William and Mary College, following in the tradition of Jefferson and Monroe. And he went on to become governor of Virginia, just as his father had done. Tall and gaunt, he had a prominent Roman nose which he liked to make fun of. He had a courtly bearing and a silvery voice which he frequently utilized for impassioned oratory. It led him to Congress and then the Senate, where he switched parties and became a Whig. And in 1840, he was chosen to run as William Henry Harrison's vice president. He was the Tyler II to Harrison's Tippecanoe, and the popular duo were victorious in November. Just 1 month after Harrison's inauguration, John Tyler was awakened at his home in Williamsburg, Virginia, with a message that the president was dead. Now, after 52 years of nationhood and 9 presidents, the question of presidential succession would have to be faced. But interpreting the Constitution on the subject was confusing, and it was unclear whether the vice president was to assume the office itself with all its powers, or merely to serve as a temporary fill-in.
I am under Providence made the instrument of a new test, which is for the first time to be applied to our institutions.
When Tyler reached Washington on the following morning, he found he was being called the vice president, acting as president, and his excellency. And when he summoned Harrison's cabinet to meet with him at Brown's Hotel, he was told that all administration matters would have to be approved by them. But the cabinet members were not counting on what Tyler said next.
I am very glad to have in my cabinet such able statesmen as you, but I can never consent to being dictated to as to what I shall or shall not do. I am the president. When you think otherwise, your resignations will be accepted.
Caught off guard by his bold stance, one after another the cabinet members backed down. John Tyler had claimed the presidency itself with all its powers, and soon afterwards he was officially sworn into office.
By assuming the office, by declaring he'd assumed it, by swearing the president's oath to preserve and defend the Constitution, and actually by delivering an inaugural address. Mr. Tyler went whole hog. He did the whole thing. And this took lots of people aback, but there wasn't anything they could do about it. I think it was a good precedent, a necessary precedent, and I think Tyler's to be congratulated on his decision, on his action.
Despite his strong assertion of executive authority, from the outset, Tyler's presidency came under fire. Refusing to subordinate himself to Congress, he vetoed a series of important Whig bills and was called a traitor to the party. Just 4 months into his administration, 5 of his 6 cabinet members resigned in protest. And when he immediately replaced them with men he believed would be more loyal, the congressional Whig leaders formally expelled him from the party ranks.
From the moment of my assuming the helm, my ship was tempest-tossed. A vice president who succeeds to the presidency in this way has no party at his heels to sustain his measures.
To make matters worse, his wife Letitia died a year later, leaving Tyler also with the distinction of being the first president to become a widower while in office. But it wasn't long before Tyler became interested in Julia Gardner, a wealthy New Yorker 30 years his junior. The two were together during a weapon demonstration aboard the Navy's newest vessel, the Princeton, when a bow gun exploded, killing Tyler's Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Navy, and Julia's father. The incident pulled the couple together, and 4 months later it was reported that they were secretly married in New York City.
What has been talked of is consummated, and Julia Gardner, the most lovely of her sex, is my own wedded wife.
Back in Washington, Tyler faced more disruption within his cabinet than has ever occurred in presidential history. Its 6 positions filled and refilled by 22 different occupants. Tyler's most important act, his support of the annexation of Texas, was heavily criticized as a cynical effort to expand the reach of slavery. And when Tyler vetoed a tariff bill, the House of Representatives introduced the first impeachment resolution ever lodged against the president. Though the effort by members of Congress was unsuccessful, Tyler was burned in effigy in a dozen different cities.
He regarded himself as above parties, as non-party, and naturally, Whig partisans in Congress were rendered furious by that. Once the party system is established, nothing can be worse than a president who forgets the party he's supposed to belong to.
I have been so rudely buffeted by the waves of party politics that I sigh for the quiet of my country residence. I look most anxiously to when my connection with political life will expire.
On February 22, 1845, Washington said farewell to Tyler at a gala White House party, where he managed one of the few witticisms of his presidency.
They cannot say now that I am a president without a party.
In the end, the hallmark of John Tyler's turbulent presidency was the manner in which it had begun. Stubborn and uncompromising, he had permanently established the pattern of vice presidential succession, a tradition which would forever after be known as the Tyler precedent.
A president elected by the people comes into office at the head of a triumphant party. Not so, however, with a vice president who succeeds to the presidency by the demise of the president. I had to follow the lights of my own judgment.
Which brings us to everybody's favorite portion of the day, our assignment. Now, in today's assignment, it's a forum, and I want you to post and tell me 3 new things that you learned during this chapter. They could be anything that you didn't know about the Jacksonian era and have since learned and maybe found interesting. There really aren't any wrong answers for this, but I do have some expectations for your response. And we've talked about this in the past. Anytime I ask for a written response, I'm looking for, at the very least, a paragraph. So today's assignment is worth 14 points, 10 for your initial response, and then two for each time you comment on one of your fellow classmates. And I won't be grading you on what you found interesting, but whether or not you can describe why you found it interesting. one word or just a couple of phrases, that's not going to be acceptable. So in your response, you should include the following: the three things that you learned or found interesting from this time period, why you found these interesting, and any questions that you may still have about the Jacksonian era. So like I said, you can get up to 10 points for your initial response and up to 2 points each time you comment on one of your classmates' responses. So the total number you can get is 14. You are allowed to comment more than twice, but in order to get full credit, you have to comment at least twice. Okay? And I put in my own little 2 cents about some of the things I learned in Chapter 2, but you're going to have to click on the discussion in order to see that. All right? Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing what you learned about the Jacksonian era.